The exclusive policy roundtable in Washington, D.C., had the air of a scripted media stunt. George Soros, the billionaire power broker, sat at the head of the long mahogany table surrounded by sympathetic lawmakers, journalists, and think tank operatives. His presence radiated control. This was his room, his agenda, and, in his mind, his rules. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt sat poised but unyielding. She hadn't been invited as a collaborator, she had been summoned as the token opposition, a young conservative voice meant to be outnumbered and overwhelmed. But Karoline wasn't there to play defense. She had come prepared to call out the globalist agenda she believed had eroded American sovereignty. The meeting began predictably. Soros spoke with a calm but calculated tone about safeguarding democracy and building inclusive borders. His words drew nods from his allies, but Karoline caught the selective phrasing immediately. When she raised her first objection, that Soros's policy funding had spiked crime and destabilized communities, the atmosphere shifted. A few eyebrows lifted. The cameras tilted toward her. Soros chuckled condescendingly. "Young lady," he began, "I've been shaping global policy since before you were born. You can't expect to understand the complexities here." Karoline's reply was instant, "And yet, with all your decades of experience, you've managed to turn thriving neighborhoods into war zones." "I understand that perfectly." The room stirred. Soros's smirk faded. He leaned forward slightly, signaling that the polite fencing was over. Karoline's tone had drawn blood, and she knew it. The verbal chess match was about to become a full-blown battle. The discussion around the table began to fragment as Karoline's words lingered in the air like an unwelcome truth. A few attendees shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to seeing Soros challenged so directly in his own curated environment. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, a faint glint of irritation flashing in his eyes. "I see," Soros said slowly, his accent sharpening his tone, "you've come here to lecture me about matters far beyond your political comprehension." The remark was coded in intellectual superiority, but it carried an unmistakable undercurrent of anger. Karoline didn't flinch. "What you call comprehension, Mr. Soros, most Americans call common sense. You can fund all the academic studies you want, but the facts on the ground show your policies are hurting working families." Her voice was steady but forceful, as though she was speaking for every voice that never got invited to rooms like this. The tension ratcheted up with every exchange. Soros's allies interjected, trying to run interference, tossing out talking points about economic justice and shared global responsibility. Karoline met each one with precision, citing data, stories, and realities they couldn't easily spin away. Soros's patience thinned visibly. He placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward. "This is my meeting," he said firmly, "and I will not have it hijacked by your baseless accusations." Karoline fired back without missing a beat. "Then maybe you should stop giving me so much to work with." The room froze. A ripple of muffled gasps spread among the guests. Soros's jaw tightened. His voice rose, not in a controlled retort, but in something closer to a shout, the kind of break in composure that happens when a carefully maintained public image is suddenly under siege. They were now seconds away from the infamous, "get out," moment. The air in the room felt heavier now, like the oxygen had been replaced with pure tension. George Soros's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, his usually composed expression tightening into something far less controlled. A moment before, the discussion had been sharp but contained. Now, it teetered on the edge of outright confrontation. Karoline sat unwavering, her gaze locked on him, refusing to give an inch. She wasn't just responding to his talking points anymore, she was challenging the very foundation of his influence. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that she wasn't there to play by the unspoken rules of polite political sparring. Finally, Soros leaned forward, his voice cracking the air. "Get out." The words weren't just loud, they were laced with a venom that made a few attendees flinch. It was a command, not a request, and it carried the raw frustration of someone unaccustomed to losing control in public. For a split second, the room went dead silent. Every eye shifted to Karoline, waiting to see if she would retreat, apologize, or attempt to de-escalate. But instead, she leaned in slightly, her tone calm yet cutting, the kind of calm that only comes when someone knows they hold the upper hand. "You can shout as much as you want," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "but the truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to. And neither do I." That was it, the unflinching defiance that transformed an awkward exchange into a viral moment. Phones discreetly recording from the sidelines caught every word, every flicker of Soros's face as he realized he had miscalculated. This wasn't a young political voice to be brushed aside. This was someone who could take his own stage and turn it against him, live, in real time. The moment Karoline's words cut through the silence, the energy in the room shifted from tense to electric. It was no longer just a heated exchange, it was a collision of two worlds, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare. A few attendees exchanged wide-eyed glances, others smirked quietly, as if savoring the unexpected reversal. But for some, the scene was almost too uncomfortable to watch, their gaze darting anywhere but the table where the standoff continued. George Soros, still seated but visibly rattled, leaned back with an incredulous half-smile that failed to mask his irritation. His usual arsenal of composed rebuttals seemed momentarily out of reach. Meanwhile, Karoline stayed steady in her seat, her posture a silent declaration that she wasn't going anywhere, not physically, not politically, not rhetorically. In the back of the room, several people subtly angled their phones for a better shot. Clips of the confrontation were already racing onto social media in real time, hashtags multiplying within minutes. The phrasing of her comeback, "The truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to," began trending almost instantly. Conservative commentators were already hailing it as a masterclass in fearlessness, while critics scrambled to reframe the exchange as disrespectful grandstanding. By the time the meeting limped toward its next agenda item, it was clear that the agenda itself had been hijacked. The real story was unfolding online. Twitter threads dissected every facial expression, TikTok users looped her quote over triumphant music, news sites scrambled to get their headlines up before the moment passed. Karoline didn't even check her phone during the meeting, but she didn't need to. The look on Soros's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a defense. This was a moment that would follow him, and her, far beyond the four walls of that conference room. Soros took a deep breath, clearly trying to pull the room back under his command. The sharp tension in the air hadn't faded, in fact, it was thicker now, almost visible. His trademark calm demeanor was showing cracks. He adjusted his jacket, leaned slightly forward over the podium, and spoke with deliberate precision. "Let's be clear," he began, his voice carrying that seasoned mix of authority and persuasion he'd cultivated over decades. "This isn't about personalities. This isn't about who can yell the loudest. It's about the direction of the country, about ensuring rational policies shape our future." But the problem was, his words were bouncing off an audience that had just witnessed one of the most charged exchanges of the year. People weren't thinking about rational policies, they were still replaying the moment when Soros had, in a flash of frustration, barked, "Get out," at Karoline Leavitt. That kind of raw, unfiltered moment doesn't disappear with a talking point. Karoline, standing just a few feet away, read the shift in the room like an open book. She could see it in the eyes of the audience members, the subtle smiles, the raised eyebrows, the way some leaned in as if waiting for round two. She let him speak for another 30 seconds, but every fiber of her political instinct told her this was the moment to strike again. When Soros paused to take a sip of water, she stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Soros," she said evenly, but with an undercurrent of steel, "you say this isn't about personalities, and yet you made it personal the moment you tried to throw me out of this conversation." A low murmur rolled through the room. She didn't raise her voice, but each syllable landed like a weight on the table. "You can't claim to defend democracy, and then try to silence the people who challenge your ideas. That's not leadership, that's fear." For a split second, Soros froze, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Karoline's words weren't just for him, they were for every viewer watching the live stream, for every clip that would be cut, captioned, and shared on social media within minutes. She was playing the long game, knowing full well that in the age of viral soundbites, winning the moment often mattered more than winning the policy debate. Soros glanced down at his notes, as if searching for the perfect rebuttal, but Karoline had already planted her flag in the ground. The battle for control of the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The energy in the room was no longer balanced. Soros's earlier authority seemed diminished, replaced by the awkward awareness that he'd underestimated his opponent. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore, they were witnessing a clash of generations, ideologies, and styles. Several people in the front row leaned forward, smartphones poised to record what they knew could become the next viral moment. In the back, a few attendees whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the two figures on stage like they were tracking a championship boxing match. Karoline didn't need to shout. Her confidence came from the way she held the microphone, the way she kept eye contact with Soros, and the way her pauses forced everyone to hang on to her next word. "You've spent decades pulling strings from behind the curtain," she said, her tone steady but cutting. "But America isn't a puppet stage, and I'm not here to play along with your script." A faint "boo" rippled through the crowd. Even those who disagreed with her politically couldn't deny the precision of the hit. Soros adjusted his glasses, a small gesture, but one that telegraphed discomfort to anyone paying close attention. Trying to regain footing, he began listing policy points, reeling off statistics about immigration, wealth inequality, and climate initiatives. But the problem was, Karoline wasn't trapped in his frame. She was building her own. When he mentioned misinformation, she immediately pounced. "Misinformation," she repeated, tilting her head. "That's the label you use when Americans hear the truth you don't want them to hear." Laughter and applause erupted from multiple corners of the room. Soros pressed on, but the interruption had landed. The camera zoomed in, capturing Karoline's composed smirk against Soros's tightening jaw. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was flipping the dynamic, forcing him into a reactive stance. And everyone watching knew it. This wasn't going to end with a handshake and polite applause. By now, the tension in the air was almost tangible. Soros had come into the room expecting to dictate the pace, but Karoline had taken control, and the audience knew it. Every time he tried to steer the discussion back to his prepared talking points, she intercepted with a sharper, more relatable counter. Her voice carried a clarity that cut through the formal setting. "You talk about protecting democracy," she said, pointing subtly toward him without breaking decorum, "but what you really mean is protecting your own influence. And influence, Mr. Soros, isn't a birthright, it's a responsibility. One you've been abusing." The crowd reacted like a wave crashing, half of them applauding wildly, the other half frozen in disbelief at the audacity of saying it to his face. Soros's lips tightened, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. Karoline pressed the advantage, pivoting the discussion to policies he had publicly supported that had backfired. She referenced real-world consequences, citing cities and communities that had suffered under initiatives tied to his name. "You don't live in the neighborhoods your ideas destroy," she said, her tone surgical. "You fund them, you experiment on them, and then you retreat into your gated life while the rest of America pays the price." A few gasps escaped the audience. Even in the front row, one of Soros's own aides shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Soros tried to respond, but it was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning, unfolding in real time. Karoline had shifted the audience's perception, reframing him not as a towering figure of philanthropy, but as a man cornered by his own record. The cameras caught everything, her unwavering stance, his visible frustration, the crowd's mixed reactions. This wasn't just a verbal exchange anymore. It was political theater at its rawest, and Karoline was owning the stage. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a tightening in Soros's posture, a faint tremor in his voice as he tried to retake control of the narrative. But Karoline saw it. She smelled political blood in the water and pressed forward with precision. "Mr. Soros, you've built an empire influencing elections, funding prosecutors who refuse to prosecute, and pushing policies that ordinary Americans never voted for. And yet, You stand here pretending you're a defender of democracy. That's not democracy, that's control. The audience reacted like a split screen, one side erupting in applause, the other shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to clap or recoil. Cameras zoomed in on Soros's face, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting to his team for rescue. Karoline wasn't just debating anymore, she was dismantling. She read off a list of cities where Soros-backed prosecutors had made national headlines for releasing violent offenders, connecting those policies directly to rising crime rates. The crowd's murmur grew into audible reactions, gasps, head shakes, even a few, "That's right," shouts from the back. Soros tried to counter with statistics about long-term reform, but Karoline cut in sharply. Long-term reform? Tell that to the families who've lost loved ones because your pet projects turned their neighborhoods into danger zones. You don't get to hide behind academic jargon when people's lives are on the line. The tension was electric. Soros leaned back, hands clasped tightly, as though bracing for impact. Karoline's delivery had shifted from defensive to prosecutorial. Every sentence was a blow, each fact sharpened into a weapon. By now, the audience's attention was fully on her. Even those who came in skeptical of her stance were now leaning forward, captivated by her command of the facts and her refusal to back down. She wasn't just holding her ground, she was making him play defense on his own turf. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, as George Soros leaned forward, his voice low but sharp, laced with years of political power and influence. You think you can walk in here, challenge everything I've built, and not face the consequences? His eyes were locked on Karoline, his tone dripping with disdain. The earlier outburst, the infamous, "Get out," was still ringing in everyone's ears, but now he was going for a calculated strike, the kind that could crush reputations. The journalists in the room froze, pens hovering above their notepads, cameras ready to capture every flicker of emotion. Karoline didn't flinch. Not even a blink. If anything, the corner of her mouth curled into a subtle smirk. She had been underestimated before, by the media, by seasoned political veterans, by people who believed age and status were shields against accountability. But she knew this moment was bigger than both of them. This wasn't just Soros versus Karoline, it was the embodiment of two clashing visions for America. "You've built an empire on fear," she said, her voice steady, but each word hitting like a hammer. "And now, you're afraid of someone who refuses to bow to it. That's why you shouted at me. That's why you want me gone. Because the second I speak the truth, your narrative cracks." Her words were deliberate, echoing through the room, drawing murmurs from the press. Soros's jaw tightened. The man who was used to dominating conversations was now being challenged in front of an audience that smelled blood in the water. He tried to interject, but Karoline raised her hand slightly, not in a disrespectful way, but with the commanding presence of someone who knew she had the floor. "You told me to get out," she continued, her tone now gaining momentum. "But you don't get to decide who has a voice in this country. You don't get to bully people into silence just because you can write a bigger check. You may have influence, Mr. Soros, but I have the truth, and the truth doesn't answer to you." A few gasps broke the silence, followed by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. It was the kind of exchange that would explode online within hours, clipped, shared, debated. The political heavyweight versus the unapologetic newcomer. Karoline took a single step forward, closing the gap between them just enough to show she wasn't intimidated. "You can tell me to leave 100 times," she said, her voice dropping into a near whisper that somehow carried across the entire room, "but I'm not going anywhere. Not today. Not tomorrow. And definitely not because you told me to." At that moment, it wasn't just a verbal clash, it was a battle of wills, and the tide was turning. The audience could feel it. Soros, for perhaps the first time in years, looked like a man who'd lost control of the narrative. And Karoline? She looked like someone who had just claimed it. The moment hung in the air like a suspended note, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. George Soros's glare was unwavering, but the damage had been done. The "get out" he had hurled minutes ago had transformed from a command into a rallying cry, not for him, but for Karoline Leavitt's supporters who were already lighting up social media. Clips of her fiery response were being cut, captioned, and shared at lightning speed, each one amplifying the shockwave that had just hit the political sphere. Soros shifted back in his chair, clearly recalculating. The man who had mastered the art of controlling a narrative could feel it slipping through his fingers. For years, his presence alone was enough to silence opposition. But this time, the person standing across from him wasn't just challenging his words, she was dismantling his aura of untouchable authority, piece by piece, in real time. Karoline, still standing tall, glanced briefly at the sea of cameras. She wasn't grandstanding, she was making sure every American watching would remember that she didn't back down. "Mr. Soros," she said with a calm that only made her words more cutting, "people like you think you can dictate who belongs in this conversation. But you forget one thing, this isn't your country alone. And it sure as hell isn't for sale." Gasps echoed again. Soros leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, the faintest twitch betraying his frustration. He tried to interject one last time, but Karoline didn't give him the satisfaction of another back and forth. Instead, she turned slightly toward the audience, a symbolic shift that signaled who she was really talking to. "You told me to get out," she continued, voice now carrying the cadence of a closer. "But I'm staying right here. I'm staying in this fight, because if I leave, you win. And I'm not here to make life comfortable for billionaires who think they own America. I'm here for the people who are tired of being told they don't matter." Her tone was unshakable, each sentence a deliberate strike. The reporters were scribbling faster, the cameras zooming in, hungry for every second of this confrontation. It wasn't just a soundbite anymore, it was a moment, the kind that crystallizes into political legend. Soros sat back, realizing there was no recovering the upper hand today. The verbal duel was over, and in the eyes of the public, Karoline had won decisively. As she turned to leave the stage, a wave of applause erupted from the back of the room, hesitant at first, then building into something impossible to ignore. It was an unplanned, unscripted endorsement of her stand. By the time she stepped outside, her phone was already buzzing, texts from allies, strangers, even political rivals who couldn't help but acknowledge the force of what had just happened. In that instant, Karoline wasn't just the young conservative spokeswoman who had gone toe-to-toe with George Soros. She was the symbol of what it looks like when someone refuses to be silenced. And Soros? For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one controlling the story. In the end, what unfolded between George Soros and Karoline Leavitt was more than just a fiery exchange, it was a collision of two very different visions for America, played out in front of millions. Soros's command to "get out" was meant to shut her down, but instead, it became the spark that lit one of the most defiant and resonant moments of her career. Karoline didn't just respond, she seized the moment, turned it on its head, and reminded everyone watching that no amount of money or influence can silence conviction. Her words were sharp, her presence unshakable, and her refusal to back down sent a clear message: if you want her gone, you'll have to do more than shout. And as the applause echoed and the clips went viral, it was clear, this was no longer just about a single confrontation. It was about the fight to have a voice, the right to stand your ground, and the truth that sometimes, the loudest thing you can say, is that you're not going anywhere.